Chapter 1. The Queen Who Would Not Stand Down. Search the history of African resistance to European colonialism, and one figure stands above almost all others: Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba, the woman who fought the Portuguese Empire for the better part of 4 decades, and never truly broke. She was a diplomat who outwitted colonial governors face to face, a general who led armies in the field, and a stateswoman who rebuilt a shattered kingdom when everything seemed lost. She died in 1663, aged around 80, in her own bed, in her own palace, as queen of a realm the Portuguese had never managed to conquer. She is celebrated today as the mother of Angola, and a statue of her stands in the capital, Luanda. But the legend that has grown around her is larger and wilder than the history, and it does Njinga no favors. The real woman was more complicated, more human, and in many ways, more impressive than the myth. This book tells her story from the beginning, the world she was born into, the crises she navigated, and the extraordinary life she actually lived. As always in griot history, where legend parts from fact, we say so plainly. Chapter 2. West Central Africa, Before the Storm. To understand Njinga, we need to understand the world she came from. And it was nothing like the empty wilderness that European accounts so often imagined. In the highlands of present-day Angola, between the Kwanza and Lukala rivers, lay the kingdom of Ndongo, ruled by the Mbundu-speaking people whose king held the title of Njula. That title, Njela, would eventually give the Portuguese colony its name, Angola. Ndongo was an organized, hierarchical state. The Njola ruled from a capital called the Kabasa, surrounded by a court of nobles and officials. Provincial chiefs called Sobas governed the regions, paid tribute to the king, and answered to a council of senior figures. Across the kingdom, farmers cultivated the river valleys, traders moved goods along well-used paths, and metalworkers and craftspeople supplied the needs of a settled society. To the north lay the powerful kingdom of Congo, with which Ndongo had long and complex relations. To the east lay the kingdom of Matamba, ruled by its own traditions. And on the coast to the west, from around 1575, a new force had begun to make itself felt: Portuguese settlers who had built a settlement at Luanda and were hungry, above all else, for enslaved people to send to their colony in Brazil. Chapter 3. A kingdom under pressure. The Portuguese did not arrive as traders who gradually became colonizers. They arrived as colonizers from almost the start. Their settlement at Luanda, founded in 1575, was a base for a specific, brutal purpose: to capture and export enslaved Africans to Brazil, where Portuguese landowners needed forced labor for their sugar plantations. To feed this trade, the Portuguese needed 2 things: a reliable source of captives and control of the routes that carried them to the coast. Both required them to break the power of the inland kingdoms. Through the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they pressed repeatedly against Ndongo, allying with the Mbangala, a formidable warrior society known for their devastating military discipline. To strike deeper into the country, by the time Njinga was born, around 1583, the kingdom her father ruled was already under siege. Raids took people from villages and sold them into the Atlantic trade. Wars disrupted farming and drove communities from their land. The capital itself had been threatened more than once. The Portuguese governor in Luanda wanted, ultimately, a territory he could control outright, with the Njola reduced to a client ruler who would deliver enslaved people on demand, or removed altogether. Ndongo was not going to give him that easily. Chapter 4. The King's Daughter. Njinga Mbande was born around 1583 to the Njula Kiluanji of Ndongo and a woman named Kengela, one of the king's concubines. The circumstances of her birth were later given legendary treatment. It was said the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck when she arrived. In Bantu tradition, a sign of exceptional destiny. The name Njinga itself is said to derive from this detail. We cannot verify the story, but the name is real, and the tradition around it is consistent with the culture she was born into. Her mother's status as a concubine, rather than a principal wife, would matter later. In Mbundu society lineage passed through the mother's line, Njinga and her half-brother Njula Bandi were not members of the same matrilineal clan, a fact that would be used against her when she later claimed power. What the sources suggest through her later career is that she received an unusual education for a royal woman. She absorbed the language of statecraft, spent time close to her father's court, and learned, crucially, to speak and read Portuguese from visiting missionaries. That last skill would prove decisive for a country under sustained pressure from a Portuguese-speaking colonial power. The woman who understood both worlds was already more valuable than anyone around her knew. Chapter 5. Her brother's kingdom in crisis. When Njinga's father died, her half-brother Njula Mbandi took the throne of Ndongo. By most accounts, he proved unequal to the crisis his kingdom faced. The Portuguese governor, backed by Mbangala mercenaries, continued to press against Ndongo. Mbandi attempted to resist but suffered serious defeats. His capital was overrun in campaigns around 1618 to 1621, and he retreated with his court to a fortified island refuge in the Kwanza River. In this desperate situation, Mbandi made the one decision that seems clearly correct. He chose his sister to negotiate with the Portuguese on his behalf. Whatever tensions existed between them, he understood that she possessed qualities he lacked: the diplomatic intelligence, the language skills, the psychological authority needed to face a colonial governor as an equal. And Njinga's relationship with her brother was strained and complicated. Portuguese and other sources later claimed that she had him murdered to seize the throne. But these claims come largely from enemies who had reason to blacken her name, and historians today treat them with considerable caution. Mbandi died in 1624 under circumstances that remain genuinely unclear. He may have been poisoned. He may have taken his own life in despair at his situation. The charge against Njinga is unproven and contested. What is certain is that she was the one with the will and the skill to act when the kingdom needed it most. Chapter 6. The Journey to Luanda. In 1621, Njinga set out for the Portuguese settlement of Luanda on the coast. A journey of consequence for herself and for history. She traveled as the official envoy of her brother, the Njula, empowered to negotiate terms that might relieve the pressure on Ndongo and secure the release of Mbundu captives held by the Portuguese. The mission was genuinely dangerous. To enter Luanda was to enter Portuguese territory, on Portuguese terms, and to deal with a governor who held most of the cards. The Portuguese had military superiority on the coast. They controlled access to trade goods the kingdom needed, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to use force without restraint. To go at all required courage. To go with any prospect of success required something rarer, the ability to negotiate from weakness as if from strength, and to read the personalities across the table with precision. Njinga carried no army to the coast. She carried her intelligence, her composure, her language skills, and her absolute refusal to be seen as lesser. What happened at that meeting would be recorded, retold, and argued over for centuries. Even in the versions that historians treat most cautiously, one fact is clear: Njinga arrived in Luanda and changed the terms of the conversation between Ndongo and Portugal. Nothing about the encounter was accidental. Chapter 7. The Chair That Was Not Offered. The most famous episode in Njinga's life comes from the 1622 meeting with Portuguese Governor Yotio Correia de Sousa, and it is one of the few dramatic stories about her that most historians accept has a real foundation. though details vary between sources. The governor sat in the room's only chair. For Njinga, there was only a floor mat, a position that in Mbundu custom was appropriate for subordinates, and petitioners not for the envoy of a sovereign state. It was a deliberate insult designed to establish, before a word was spoken, that Ndongo's representative was a supplicant and Portugal's governor was the power. Njinga's response became legendary. She gestured to one of her attendants, who knelt down. She sat upon the attendant's back, as if on a throne, met the governor's eye level, and conducted the entire negotiation from that position. The message was unmistakable. She had not come to kneel. We know the story mainly from Portuguese and Italian missionary accounts, written years after the event, and it may have been refined in the retelling. But the core, a deliberate diplomatic insult, and a composed and devastating countermove, is consistent with everything else we know of Njinga's character. It is the kind of act that lives in the historical record because those who witnessed it could not forget it. Chapter 8. Baptism and Broken Promises. At the conclusion of the 1622 meeting, Njinga converted to Christianity. Taking the name Dona Ana de Souza, the Portuguese governor himself serving as her godfather. Portuguese sources recorded this as a spiritual conversion. Historians are more measured. For Njinga, conversion was almost certainly a political calculation. Christianity was the shared language of legitimacy in the Portuguese-controlled world. To be baptized was to claim a seat at the diplomatic table, to be addressed as a fellow Christian rather than dismissed as a pagan queen. The treaty she negotiated in Luanda was, on paper, a meaningful achievement. Portugal agreed to withdraw forces from Ndongo, release Mbundu captives, and recognize the kingdom's standing. In return, Ndongo would accept Portuguese trading relations and some degree of Portuguese influence. But the Portuguese did not honor the agreement. The forts stayed. The slave raids continued. The Mbangala remained in the field, serving Portuguese interests. Njinga had negotiated in good faith, and the other side had not. Tekwan di Banti. This pattern, of Portugal making agreements it had no intention of keeping, would repeat itself across the next 4 decades, and each repetition hardened Njinga's understanding of what she was dealing with. The baptism remained, the treaty did not. Chapter 9. Queen of Ndongo. Njolambandi died in 1624. Njinga moved swiftly into the resulting power vacuum. The exact sequence of events is disputed. Sources disagree on whether she was formally appointed regent, whether she seized authority directly, and whether she bore any responsibility for her brother's death. Historians today largely set aside the poisoning claim as unproven, rooted in hostile accounts. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Njinga became the effective ruler of Ndongo. Her claim was not uncontested. In Mbundu society, succession was complex, and her mother's status as a concubine gave rivals a pretext to challenge her legitimacy. Some nobles and sobas preferred a more manageable successor. Portugal, which had its own candidate in mind for a puppet Njinga, refused to recognize her. None of that stopped her. Njinga ruled. She reorganized the court, built alliances among the sobas, and began assembling a military force capable of genuine resistance. She understood that paper treaties were worthless. What mattered was the capacity to hold ground by force. And so the woman who had gone to Luanda as a diplomat began building herself into something the Portuguese had not anticipated: a military commander capable of standing against the best-equipped European army in the region. The warrior queen the world would remember was taking shape. Chapter 10. The Mbangala Alliance. Among the decisions that defined Njinga's reign, and that later generations found most uncomfortable, was her alliance with the Mbangala. The Mbangala were a formidable warrior society who had originally served as Portuguese mercenaries, helping to devastate Ndongo in the campaigns of the 1610s and early 1620s. They lived by a strict warrior code, rejected settled agriculture, and moved through the country as a highly mobile fighting force. Njinga understood that the enemy's most effective weapon could become her own. Sometime in the late 1620s, she formed an alliance with an Mbangala band, and, by most accounts, adopted a number of their customs and practices, the precise nature of which is disputed in the sources, and reported with obvious hostility by her Portuguese enemies, who had every reason to paint her as monstrous. What is clear is that the alliance was strategically brilliant. It gave her battle-hardened, disciplined fighters to supplement her Ndongo forces. It also removed a key weapon from the Portuguese arsenal. Her enemies wrote of the alliance with horror. Her admirers point out she was doing what any realist in her position would do, using every tool available against a far more powerful adversary. The hard ethical questions this raised are worth sitting with. Njinga was fighting a war for her people's survival. The choices she made in that war were not all clean. Chapter 11. Flight and Reinvention. By around 1629, the Portuguese and their allies had intensified their campaign against Ndongo to the point where Njinga could no longer hold it against them. Rather than surrender, she did something that would define the next chapter of her life. She moved. Taking as many of her people as she could, she withdrew eastward and began again. First, she moved to the island of Ndongo in the Kwanza River, using the river as a natural defensive barrier. Then she turned her attention to a more permanent solution. The Kingdom of Matamba lay to the east, ruled by its own queen. Between 1631 and 1635, Njinga conquered Matamba and established it as her new sovereign base. This was not mere retreat, it was strategic reinvention. Matamba occupied a crucial geographical position. It controlled access routes between the coast and the deep interior of Central Africa, sitting astride the most important slave trade corridors. Whoever ruled Matamba could tax the trade that flowed through it, or block it entirely. Njinga intended to use that power as leverage in every negotiation to come. The woman driven from her ancestral kingdom had not been broken. She had found a stronger position, and from it she would spend the rest of her life making the Portuguese deeply uncomfortable. The war for the region was not over. It was entering a new phase. Chapter 12. A Queen in Her Own Right. Matamba under Njinga was not simply a refuge. It became a kingdom in its own right, and she its sovereign. She governed it with the same administrative intelligence she had brought to Ndongo, building alliances with local sobas, integrating Mbangala fighting units into a coherent military structure, and using her control of the interior trade routes as both revenue and diplomatic leverage. Notably, Njinga constructed a court in which women played an unusually prominent role. She surrounded herself with female advisors and officials, building a governing structure less dependent on the traditional male nobility that had challenged her legitimacy in Ndongo. She reportedly dressed her male concubines as women and had them serve in her household, a practice Portuguese observers recorded with outrage. Historians debate what this meant in its cultural context. What is clear is that Njinga was deliberately constructing a court on her own terms. She also never abandoned her claim to Ndongo. The Portuguese had installed their own puppet Angola there, a man of their choosing who served their interests. Njinga refused to recognize him and continued to press her case, diplomatically, militarily, and through correspondence, for the rest of her life. Matamba was not a consolation prize. It was a launching pad from which she would continue the struggle. Chapter 13. The Dutch arrive. In 1641, the strategic picture shifted dramatically. The Dutch West India Company, locked in its own struggle with Portugal for control of Atlantic trade, seized the port city of Luanda, the beating heart of Portuguese power on the Angolan coast. For Njinga, This was an extraordinary opportunity. The enemy of her enemy was not necessarily her friend, but they were potentially her ally. She moved quickly, sending envoys and negotiating a formal military alliance. One of the first recorded alliances between an African state and a European power on anything approaching equal terms. The Dutch needed a strong partner in the interior. She needed the firepower and coastal pressure only the Dutch could provide. What followed was Njinga's most successful military period. Between 1641 and 1648, her forces, coordinating with Dutch troops, drove the Portuguese back and recaptured significant portions of Ndongo. In the Battle of Combi in October 1647, Njinga's army of thousands of archers, fighting alongside a Dutch contingent, delivered one of the most significant defeats the Portuguese forces in Angola had suffered. For a moment it looked as if decades of resistance might actually succeed. The Portuguese colony seemed genuinely threatened. Then, in 1648, a Portuguese fleet arrived from Brazil and retook Luanda. The Dutch withdrew from Angola entirely, and Njinga was alone again. Chapter 14, The Long War. The Portuguese retaking of Luanda in 1648 did not end the war. It ended the phase Njinga had come closest to winning. She retreated again to Matamba and continued to fight, conducting raids, supporting resistance, and maintaining her refusal to accept the legitimacy of the Portuguese colony, or their puppet ruler in Ndongo. The years from 1648 into the mid-1650s were the hardest of her reign. She was now in her 60s. The kingdom she was protecting had been at war, in one form or another, for most of her adult life. Portuguese raiders had taken thousands of her people into the slave trade she had spent decades resisting. Some Sobas who had once backed her made their own accommodations with the Portuguese. Her military options were narrower, and yet she continued. The guerrilla campaigns Njinga sustained from Matamba kept the Portuguese from consolidating their hold on the interior. Her kingdom remained an independent sovereign state, not a Portuguese possession, not a client realm. Her very existence as a reigning queen was itself a statement that 40 years of colonial military pressure had not broken her. The Long War was not glorious. It was grinding, costly, and filled with loss. That Njinga sustained it as long as she did is, in some ways, the most remarkable thing about her entire extraordinary life. Chapter 15. Diplomacy never stopped. Throughout the decades of warfare, Njinga never abandoned the diplomatic arena. She was as active at the negotiating table, and in written correspondence as she was in the field. She wrote letters to Portuguese governors, to the Pope, to European courts, presenting her case for sovereignty, protesting violations of agreements, and framing herself in terms that European readers would understand and respect. This diplomatic campaign was sophisticated and deliberate. Njinga understood that the Portuguese colonial project was legitimized in European eyes, partly through religious frameworks. She used those same frameworks against them, writing as a Christian queen, whose rights were being violated by fellow Christians who broke church-blessed treaties. She corresponded with Capuchin missionaries who visited her court, whose accounts provided another channel to European opinion. She also continued to manage the slave trade routes that ran through Matamba, sometimes redirecting trade, sometimes taxing it, sometimes blocking it entirely, depending on the leverage a given moment required. She was not opposed to trade with Europeans in principle. She was opposed to the destruction of her kingdom's sovereignty and the enslavement of her people. Those two positions required different tools in different moments, and she deployed them all. Her diplomatic letters survive. They are among the most remarkable documents produced by any African ruler of the era. Chapter 16. Return to Christianity. In the 1650s, with the military situation in stalemate, and the possibility of a negotiated peace opening up, Njinga returned formally to Christianity. It was not her first conversion, She had been baptized in 1622 and had set Christian practice aside during the years of the Mbangala alliance. Now, around 1656 to 1657, she was received back into the Catholic Church by Capuchin missionaries working in her territory. Whether this reflected genuine faith, strategic repositioning, or some combination of both is a question historians continue to debate. What we can say is that it aligned with a broader turn in Njinga's late reign, from warfare toward consolidation. She permitted mission work in Matamba, welcomed the Capuchins to her court, and in her final years sponsored the building of churches in her kingdom. The Capuchin accounts of her late reign are among the most detailed sources we have. Father Antonio Gaeta, who lived in Matamba and knew Njinga in her 70s, recorded his observations carefully. His portrait is of a formidably intelligent woman, still governing her kingdom with precision, still fully in command, who had found, in the formal structures of the church, a language useful for the work of peace. The peace treaty with Portugal, ratified in Lisbon in November 1657, recognized Njinga's rule over Matamba. It did not restore Ndongo. She had not won everything she fought for. She had not lost either. Chapter 17. Peace and Reconstruction. The Peace Treaty of 1657 opened the final chapter of Njinga's reign, and she used it purposefully. With formal warfare paused, she turned her considerable energies toward the kingdom she had spent a lifetime defending. She worked to rehabilitate people who had been enslaved and then returned to her territory, integrating them back into Matamba's communities. She promoted family formation and childbirth to replenish a population devastated by decades of raids and warfare. She sponsored the building of churches, invited missionaries to open schools, and worked to re-establish the agricultural foundations of a kingdom that war had disrupted. This reconstruction work was not simply benevolent. It was the work of a ruler who understood that a kingdom's strength rested on its people, their numbers, their skills, their willingness to stay and build rather than flee. Njinga had kept Matamba alive through force of arms and force of will. Now she was trying to make it flourish. She also ensured that the institutions of Matamba would outlast her. The dynasty she built would pass to women rulers for most of the century after her death. At least 80 of the 104 years following her reign were governed by queens. Njinga had not merely fought to survive. She had built something that endured. Chapter 18. The Woman Behind the Legend. Njinga died on 17 December 1663, aged around 80. A remarkable age for anyone in the 17th century, let alone for a person who had spent decades conducting wars and surviving the chaos of colonial conflict. She died in Matamba, in her own palace, as its undisputed queen. The Portuguese colony on the coast she had never submitted to outlived her. Ndongo, the kingdom of her birth, remained under Portuguese-backed rule. But Matamba stood. The legend that grew around her in the centuries after her death was vivid and sometimes wild. She was cast as an Amazon who personally led every charge. She was accused by hostile sources of crimes she may not have committed. She was claimed, in the 20th century, by the Angolan independence movement as a founding mother of the nation, a powerful but inevitably selective use of her story. The real Njinga sits somewhere more interesting than the legend. She was neither the saint her admirers wanted, nor the monster her enemies described. She was a political genius in the most complete sense, someone who understood power, used every tool available, made hard choices with clear eyes, and held her kingdom together for 40 years against an adversary that had destroyed others in a fraction of that time. She was also a woman in a world that gave women almost no formal power, who simply took power anyway, and held it for a lifetime. Chapter 19. Mother of Angola. Today a bronze statue of Queen Njinga stands in Independence Square in Luanda, the capital of Angola. She strides forward, staff in hand, gaze toward the future. Or perhaps toward the Portuguese ships that once threatened to erase everything she was born to protect. Angolans call her Njinga, and she is taught in schools as the founding mother of the nation's spirit of resistance. The 20th century independence movement that ended Portuguese colonial rule in 1975, more than 3 centuries after Njinga's death, explicitly claimed her as an ancestor of their struggle. Njinga's resistance to Portuguese colonialism was real. The connection between her fight and the later independence movement is a genuine thread in Angolan historical consciousness, not a modern invention. Her legacy also crossed the Atlantic. Enslaved Africans from the Angolan coast carried memories of her into Brazil and the Caribbean, where her name and story persisted in oral tradition. She became a figure of resistance, not just in Angola, but wherever people of that diaspora kept alive the knowledge of where they came from. What we should also remember is that history is not simply a supply of usable ancestors. Njinga was a complex figure who made choices, some inspiring, some troubling, in response to the impossible pressures of her time. The honest version of her story, with all its complexity, is more powerful than any simplified myth. Angola's mother deserves the truth. Chapter 20. What we really know. So what do we actually know, and how firmly do we know it? The honest answer is quite a lot, and less certainly than the boldest retellings suggest. Our primary sources are imperfect. Most come from Portuguese colonial administrators and Italian Capuchin missionaries, people who had their own agendas, whether hostile or sympathetic. The famous chair story is recorded in missionary accounts from years after the event. The accusations of fratricide come largely from Portuguese records, written by her enemies. Njinga's own diplomatic letters survive and are among the most direct evidence of her voice. And self-presentation, but even letters are constructed documents. What the sources agree on is the outline. An extraordinarily capable woman became effective ruler of Ndongo in the 1620s. Resisted Portuguese attempts to destroy or subordinate her kingdom for nearly 4 decades. Conquered Matamba and built it into a sovereign state. Negotiated a formal peace in 1657 that recognized her rule, and died in 1663 as a reigning queen. The dramatic details, the chair, the Mbangala alliance, the disputed circumstances of her brother's death, are real in the sense that they appear in historical sources, and uncertain in the sense that those sources have known limitations. Griot history marks legend as legend. The core of Njinga's story needs no embellishment. It is remarkable enough as fact. A note on history and sources. Queen Njinga's life is documented more richly than many African rulers of her era. But our sources have significant limitations. Most come from Portuguese colonial administrators and Italian Capuchin missionaries, all of whom had their own perspectives and agendas. The famous chair episode is recorded in missionary accounts written years after the event. The accusations of fratricide come largely from Portuguese sources who had reason to discredit her. Njinga's own diplomatic letters survive and are among the most direct evidence of her voice, though letters are always constructed documents. Modern historians who have worked carefully on Njinga include John K. Thornton, whose scholarship on West Central African history provides essential context, and Linda Haywood, whose Njinga of Angola, Africa's Warrior Queen, Harvard University Press. 2017 is the most thorough recent scholarly biography in English. The Portuguese scholar Beatrix Heinze has also contributed important primary source research. Where this book marks something as legend or disputed, the circumstances of Njula Mbandi's death, the precise details of the chair episode, the exact nature of Njinga's Mbangala practices. This reflects the genuine state of the historical record. The solid documented core of Njinga's life needs no embellishment. The illustrations in this book are artistic interpretations created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. They are not photographs, historical portraits, or contemporary depictions of any real person. No verified portrait of Queen Njinga from her lifetime survives. All visual representations of her, including these, are artistic reconstructions. About Griot. Griot tells the true stories of African and Black history with the care they deserve, researched, sourced, and beautifully illustrated. If you enjoyed this book, look out for more in the series. Copyright 2026, published independently via Griot.